Welcome to Holyrude Ungagged, the Lisa Coyle of political podcasts. Season 7, Episode 3. I am your host, David McClemont, broadcasting from the Blantyre Free State. And this week, completing a duo on the pod is journalist, activist, Republican socialist, and Dundee's favoured son, it's Connor Beaton. Welcome, Connor.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'll need to change that. Dundee's favoured son, soon to be Edinburgh's favoured son, is that right?
Yeah, within a couple of weeks.
Had some technical issues, and just before I started, I spilled half a can of Pepsi down my front, so...
This is really divisive podcast. I'm drinking Coca-Cola.
That's because you're a capitalist. And with Pepsi, they're the sort of little upstarts when it comes to the international soft drink market. What the fuck am I talking about? Anyway.
But they once had the second largest navy in the world, is that right? I don't think you call them small upstarts.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's a...
No, this might be a true story about Pepsi getting paid by the Soviet Union in scrap destroyers.
I heard that, but I dug into it one time, and apparently the Soviet Union did offer them all these sort of ships, but they actually said, we'd rather have money, surprisingly. So they never actually accepted them. So I think if Pepsi had agreed that deal, it might have been true. Although I think I also read that it said even if they accepted it, it wouldn't have made them, I don't know how many, biggest navy. But that is a cool story.
I choose to believe it, David. Best Contra deal in the world.
Well,
I just learned that term recently, by the way, Contra deal. Have you heard that one before?
To do with the Iran-Contra deal?
Well, that's what... So a Contra deal apparently is when you exchange something in kind. And I heard someone at my work saying it, just like casually, Contra deal. And all I could think was, is that because of Iran-Contra? Is that where that comes from?
I'd imagine it would, because that was a kind of three-way sort of exchange. So. Yeah,
well, very conflicting accounts online. If you look it up, some people say it is, and some people say, oh, it's much older than that, and you can find evidence of it. It certainly seems like maybe if it did exist before that, it was definitely popularized by it. But I don't know if people who are saying it know at all where it comes from.
Why? That would be a weird coincidence.
It would be, wouldn't it?
Because they were literally called the Contras, so...
Yeah.
Well, I
was just told by a colleague we're doing a Contra deal, and I'm like, what? Why?
I certainly am not. So how have you been enjoying the nice weather? It's been
fantastic. I actually, you know what? I sat in a beer garden the other day, and I didn't even have a beer, and I came out feeling so like happy and full of energy, and I was like, wow, just soaking up the sun actually makes me feel like that. So love to compare tans next time I see you. So. But yeah, very much enjoying it. What about you, David?
Yeah, I've been out in the garden, and today I was trying to build a enclosure for our hot tub that we got. We did buy like a kind of hot tub sort of pergola thing, but it came down in the first sort of high wind, so I'm just not prepared to spend any money on a replacement for the same thing to happen. So I'm building one out of pallets. And if that comes down, at least it's just all I've wasted is my time.
That's good.
I find I'm not handy at all, but I find that kind of work quite relaxing.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's not like Homer Simpson trying to build a barbecue pit going on out there.
The result is not necessarily that much better, but I don't get stressed out while I'm doing it. Mm. So I sort of build something, I convince myself it's great, and it's, like during lockdown, I built a bar. And then, like a year later, I was looking at it, I was like, that is just, like, crap. And I ripped it down again. It was like, I just completely, convinced myself that it was actually fine and I'd done a really good job. And it just hadn't. It was just rickety, and you had to be careful because there was sharp bits sticking out. And
I can't do anything like that. I had, David, you can see behind me a shelf on the wall. This is something that I installed with the help of my sister, and not really meant to drill holes into the walls of a rental flat. But the wall just started crumbling. It was a nightmare. And my sister, she was so confident. She was like, I can show you how this is done, Connor. I do this all the time. We need to get the right kind of drill bit, just going right in and then making a massive hole in the wall and thinking, I didn't expect that to happen. She just kind of at one point walked away from it just with a massive hole in my wall. We did finally manage to get a shelf put in there, but I'm kind of scared of putting anything heavy on it.
Yeah. It looks like it's struggling under that one book in the router.
It's a projector, actually.
All right.
I
wouldn't put the goldfish bowl or anything on it. I've actually got a similar story. My wife's like, loves staying handy, is a handyman. And we were putting up we're going to put a shelf up, and it was on an old flat, and it was like an old, tenement sort of flat. So the walls were not like, the plaster had probably been there for like 80 years. And she was like, I think I could put that up. I was away going for a night shift. I went, no, it's stone. I'll speak to my friend. He's a joiner. He'll do it because it's more complicated than you think. And then about 2 hours into my night shift, I get a text message from my wife, casually asking for my mate, who's the joiner's, phone number, because she had tried to put butterfly clips in, and like you said, it just crumbled away and left a huge hole. So by the time I got home in the morning, it had all been fixed, but not by my wife. I'm also, but it's not just the weather that's put me in a good mood. That Celtic is the double champions of Scotland now. First time the men's team and the women's team have won the title in the same season, so that put me in a very good mood.
Very good. Technically I was a big fan of St. Pauli, the German left-wing football team in Hamburg, which is my home city. Kind of gone off them because the attitude of a lot of the supporters clubs to Palestine has been atrocious over the last 8 months or so, which means that I can't really celebrate the fact that they're back in the Bundesliga. So, yeah. And I saw them play in Dunfermline last summer as well, so I'm kind of thinking that's a shame. So I'm glad you're getting to celebrate some success at least.
I think a few of the international St. Pauli fan clubs broke away over their kind of support.
Glasgow and Israel did, yeah.
I think the Barcelona one as well.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a story that's less fun. It's not all been sunshine and rainbows this weekend. I can't remember what put me in mind in it. I think I saw something to do with basketball on the telly, and it made me think when I went to Australia when I was like 10 to visit family. So I was there for a couple of months, and I was sharing a room with my cousin who's the same age as me, and he was a huge basketball fan. He was a big fan of the Perth Wildcats. So he'd like posters of all the players, and his favourite player was this guy, Tiny Pinder, which just sounds like a basketball player. And he used to sing this song. It was like a rap that the Perth Wildcats had done, and his bit was, my name's Tiny, but I'm not small. I like to shoot that basketball. And I was like, God, Tiny Pinder, not thought of him in a while. I thought, I'll Google him.
Oh, no.
He's in prison.
Oh, no. What did he do?
Serial rapist. So there, that wee happy memory, that's just...
Oh, God.
Evaporated.
See, David, you shouldn't have looked it up. You should have left that question unanswered.
Blissful ignorance.
Yeah.
So, Rory in Australia, if you're listening, I hope you've got that poster off your wall. Anyway, let's get ungagged. Okay, first up on the agenda, the new Scottish Cabinet. First Minister John Swinney has unveiled his Cabinet, with Kate Forbes taking the top role of Deputy First Minister. Mr Swinney pledged that Miss Forbes, who chose not to run in the leadership race, would play a significant part in his government. The row over Forbes' conservative evangelical beliefs, based on the Free Church of Scotland's teachings, erupted at First Minister's questions, with Patrick Harvey of the Scottish Greens say that her appointment signalled a return to the repressive values of the 1950s. So, Connor, new cabinet, but clearly the big story is that Kate Forbes has been given such a prominent position. What's your thoughts?
Well, yeah, we're saying new cabinet. The new cabinet looks a lot like the old cabinet. Really, the only change is Kate Forbes. So, obviously, the last episode that we recorded 2 weeks ago, which became dated so quickly, that was right before Kate Forbes was appointed as Deputy First Minister and also as Cabinet Secretary for the Economy. It's maybe unnecessarily retreading ground that we already covered 2 weeks ago, but just to say, I think her views on reproductive rights and LGBT plus rights make her completely unfit to have a leading role in the government. I think that's a really bad call. And I think it's really especially interesting to contrast her political views being informed by religion with what we've seen today in the Scottish census figures that were released, where we can see that Scotland, for the first time, is actually a majority non-religious country. So, according to the 2022 census, 51.1% of people in Scotland have no religion. And that's actually quite a remarkable figure when you contrast it with England and Wales, where it's 37.2%. So this is a country that has really gone off religion, but it feels like political views being informed by religion, and especially the very strong defence of that in the Scottish press, such as it is completely out of step with that. And of course, there's all these unfair, bad faith comparisons with Humza Yousaf being a Muslim. Obviously, he didn't let that stand in the way of supporting the SNP's policies on equality issues. Kate Forbes has made no clear effort on that. But yeah, we can talk about that until the cows come home. Two other things I think bear in mind. Firstly, Kate Forbes is the cabinet secretary for the economy, is the phrase. So we've scrapped this idea of the well-being economy, which was the name of that cabinet post beforehand. And I don't think it'd been that name for long. I think that was only basically under Humza Yousaf, but that idea of the well-being economy is obviously something that goes back to Nicola Sturgeon's time as First Minister. I think there has been fair criticism from the left of, okay, what does that actually mean in practice? Because you can say all kind of nice things about, well, we need to find ways to measure the success of our economy. That's not just GDP figure. A really useful example there is Ireland, because Ireland has got an incredibly high GDP per capita right now, but it's kind of fake. It's because there's all these massive multinational companies that have their European headquarters in Dublin, and obviously they have a lot of money, but it doesn't actually mean that the quality of life and that the kind of purchasing power or whatever of the average person is that much better. So, like, we can be skeptical about it, but I think there's a signal being sent there that we're not talking about the well-being economy because that's kind of airy-fairy, and this is serious. And now this is the woman that's going to repair the relationship with the business industry. So today she's off visiting a robot factory. I saw a video clip on her Twitter page where it looks like the robots from iRobot literally kind of meeting and greeting her. Yeah, it's very odd. And I don't think that's encouraging. I think, I'm a socialist. I think there's an antagonism necessarily between workers and their bosses. I don't think you can do this thing of like, well, we support business and everyone benefits from that. I think there's a really deep cost of living crisis, and I'd like to see more focus on making people's lives better, and that would be popular. I think if you look at the polls, the SNP is not exactly popular right now. And then that brings me on to the second thing, which is if you look at the junior ministerial posts below the cabinet secretaries, there's a whole bunch of them that don't exist anymore, and some people have helpfully compiled some of the terms that previously appeared in the names of ministerial posts and no longer appear. Independence, for one. And I think the government's justification for that is bizarre, where they're saying, well, actually, we're all ministers for independence because we're in the SNP, which is, okay, that's not really the point, though, because there was actually work that was being done. But things like tenants' rights, fair work, community wealth building, just transition, migration and refugees, Europe and international development, NHS recovery, circular economy, green skills. Taking these out, it doesn't mean necessarily that the government's not going to do anything on these issues, but in terms of where the priorities are, again, I think it's a signal that some of these things that we wanted to show we're really focused on have kind of fallen by the wayside, and that's, to me, worrying.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sends a kind of bad signal that some of these job titles are changing in subtle ways. But I must admit, I really don't like the trend that's crept up in politics in the last few years where you always had the same sort of cabinet positions and the same titles because governments are kind of doing the same sort of things. They might have different priorities, but the overall functions of what a government doesn't change that much. And I just felt as if were they just making up sort of mere catchy names as an alternative to actually doing something. When somebody said, what are you doing about the drugs crisis? They can say, well, we've now got a dedicated drugs minister. And it's like, well, okay, but surely you had somebody looking at it before. The fact that you changed the job title's not really that big a thing. And I think a lot of them left these titles went out of the cabinet because the two Green ministers that were previously in the cabinet, I always just felt as if their job titles sounded made up completely. Like, what was one, was it tenants' rights and things like that? It was one of the many add-ons, I think, to Patrick Harvey's brief.
He was the Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, not exactly all.
Not the housing minister.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was like, so the housing minister still actually got to be dealing with the housing. So, but you'll call your, add this tenants' rights bit to your job, and it's like, what does that really mean? And like, if you're serious about, you know, having a progressive housing policy and you're bringing the Greens into government, give them the housing brief. Don't just make up a new job title. So if I want to be very kind to John Swinney, I could say maybe he's just sort of, you know, getting rid of some of that kind of, what would be the word, sort of glossy nonsense, and just sort of trimming it back to more kind of serious, sort of streamlined sort of titles or whatever. But, you know, as part of the way Kate Forbes being brought in, some of the noises he's making as well, it does seem as if it is more about sending that signal that you said. I really don't know why he would bring in Kate Forbes unless it's just because he wants to. I don't think he needed to. I don't think he needed to promise all this in order to win. I think John Swinney would have probably beat her if she'd stood. Mm-hmm. And I think it's possible that she wouldn't have stood at all because she would know that. There was this kind of real sense in the SNP of, you know, no, we're going to go for unity and John Swinney's a unity candidate and we should all rally behind. And I think it might have hurt her if she had broke ranks there and ran against them. So it makes me think John Swinney, when he was a leader before, he took them in a very business-friendly direction. I think we all hope that, you know, 20 years later, under Severin or Nicola Sturgeon, maybe it would have softened that edge and moved in a more social democratic direction. But the early signs are concerning to me that we are moving in a more centrist, centre-right direction.
Yeah, and I think we should be careful when we talk about, you know, it's going to be a more serious government. And I think he's tried to send that idea of we're going to be streamlined, cut back, because he's also got a much smaller team of special advisors, is something that I think nobody actually cares about except Scottish journalists who've been commenting on it. But I think that the reason that there's not been a contest in the SNP leadership is because the SNP, I think everyone in the SNP, no matter what wing of the party they're on, can see that the party's in a really serious crisis. And I think the SNP is kind of always been a party that's kind of scared of politics, and they're kind of scared of popular politics. What they're trying to do now is, you know, you hear that stuff about Swinney's a safe pair of hands, you can like steady the ship, etc. They all want to hunker down and get back and get together and say, okay, we're going to settle, we're going to, you know, patch over our differences right now. We're going to really focus on doing a great job, like in a kind of technocratic way of, we're going to be really, really competent, and we're going to do less better, or whatever else the kind of the buzzword is. And this will help restore us to where we were, which is just like an incredible kind of misreading of the last 15 or even 25 years of Scottish politics, where that was the kind of managerialism that New Labour went into the Scottish Parliament with. And like, we can see how far that got them. The SNP, you know, maybe not in 2007, but certainly after the financial crisis, they were the party that was seen as maybe posing the biggest challenge to austerity. And certainly in the 2014 referendum, that is what made them overtake the Labour Party, was being seen to be the political expression of this kind of resistance to austerity and this kind of real, you know, disaffection with what was going on politically. So for them to kind of revert to form and say, you know, we're just going to do as competent a job as possible, nothing flashy, you know, speak to the dour Protestant Scotland work ethic, I don't think that's going to work. So I think, you know, we're looking at polls now where it's saying Labour have got a 10-point lead over the SNP for the Westminster election. I believe that. And, you know, we're going to see that happen. And, you know, the other thing, we're talking about Swinney's kind of personal, well, his political history. You know, you were saying he had in his previous leadership, he had a kind of right-wing slant. I was kind of going back and looking at things that the left was saying at the time that he was leader, and things that the trade union movement was saying. And there's things like, you know, he was championing replacing the council tax with a local income tax that would be like a flat rate, It's not going to be a progressive income tax. And obviously that is like a directly right-wing idea lifted from like the Republican Party in the States. But it comes at the same time where the STUC have just put out a report here in Scotland saying that a wealth tax of 2% that was just done on Scotland's 10 richest people would fund 10,000 public sector workers. So when we're looking at services, public services that are taking a hit at a local level and at a national level, and we're thinking about tax policy, you know, having a progressive tax policy and a bold tax policy is going to save services. Swinney's kind of scared of it. Kate Forbes is definitely scared of it. So who's going to put those ideas forward? Certainly not Scottish Labour Party, because they're also scared of it, because they think that the path back to victory is through the kind of the middle class. But it kind of leaves you wondering, you know, where is this going to come from, and how do we avoid, you know, Scottish public services suffering really, really badly over the next few years?
It was funny you used the phrase steady the ship, because that's exactly what I wrote in my notes about John Swinney. I think, you know, he has been brought in as this unity candidate to steady the ship and take them through the 26 elections. And I don't think he's going to last much longer than that, whether win or lose. You know, if they go into opposition, he'll certainly, I think, stand down. If he wins it, I think he would stand down relatively soon after it, maybe within a year. And Kate Forbes is now positioned perfectly to, you know, sweep in and take over. She's the heir apparent. By putting her as the Deputy First Minister has given her a kind of blessing from John Swinney and that sort of more central wing of the party. Can a wing be central? I don't know. But the left in the SNP have got 2 years to find an alternative candidate to rally around and hopefully win that leadership, because, you know, if the SNP lose in 2026, it'll be a hit to independence, clearly. But if they then react to that by putting Kate Forbes in charge, you know, they're not going to come back to power in 2030 then, or 2031, whenever the next election will be after that. So suddenly we're talking about well into the next decade before any chance of independence, which is quite a depressing thought.
Yeah, I mean, I find that a very depressing thought, considering, you know, I was brought into politics through the 2014 referendum. That was my whole kind of frame of reference for, I still very much see independence and unionism as the two main political camps in Scotland. I don't see that going away, even though independence has become, you know, feels less immediate. I think that still is a really important distinction. And also because I think it's an important signal about what your politics represents. Are you representing a politics that you can be reconciled with the British ruling class, or is it one that is always going to kind of break the mold and come outside of the box and unlock a whole number of new possibilities, which I feel very strongly is an important thing. The whole kind of messaging of what kind of country do you want to be, and, you know, that's really powerful. I can't see that actually getting completely suppressed, but we can see very clearly that the UK government's strategy, which has been to just deny a referendum, reject it, close all the democratic doors, and try and just wait the movement out and have it collapse under, especially the SNP, collapse under the weight of being in government for 20 odd years. That has worked actually remarkably well. And, you know, this is a government, you know, the British state for hundreds of years has got a lot of accumulated experience in how to suppress progressive movements like this one. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise, but it is really sad. And I think what I'm hoping will happen is that after the general election this year, and regardless of what happens in 2026, that the independence movement can kind of reorient itself as it is the grassroots opposition, the main grassroots opposition in Scotland to the Starmer government and to maybe a Starmer government, depending on how 2026 goes.
Yeah, also, I mean, despite what some of the kind of SNP fundamentalists have been screaming recently, the latest polls are showing the SNP 10 points behind Labour are also showing quite a decent increase for the Green vote. I think they were projected to get 12 seats. So even Labour looking to form a minority. I mean, Labour are not going to win a majority in the Scottish Parliament, so they'll be looking for people to work with. Will they go to the Tories? But will they feel comfortable doing that publicly? Like, in terms of, they certainly wouldn't have a coalition.
They, in practice, already do it at a local level, for example. In loads of councils across Scotland, there are de facto Labour-Tory coalitions. I think the way in which they would present it is, okay, we're a minority government, and all we're doing is negotiating to get through our budget, etc. We don't control whether they're voting for us or not. We don't control that. And I think obviously they'll just immediately jump to, our budget only got through with Tory support. Well, that was true of the SNP in 2007. Blah 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 blah. I think you'd be surprised. I really think that they'll go very shamelessly into an arrangement with the Tories. They might not say it might not be a public arrangement, but it'll be a de facto arrangement.
But, do you think the Tories are even capable of being constructive like that? Particularly if you're potentially looking at a Tory party that's been absolutely decimated at Westminster by this year's election by some of the polls.
I mean, strategically in the Scottish Parliament, it happens all the time. The vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf as First Minister, that was brought by the Tory party, but it was supported by the Labour Party. There have been amendments to legislation. There has been, for example, the way that the Tories have led the opposition, for example, to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and the Labour Party just followed in suit. I think, on the strategic issues, the coalition's there, it's ready. Do you think there's a chance we could end up with an election before 2026? Because we obviously did the vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf that was avoided by his resignation. But I feel as if Swinney's leaving himself open to a similar scenario. He's alienating the Greens. So he doesn't have a cast iron reliable majority as it stands that would see him through that. He certainly can't rely on any of the unionist parties. Labour would love, their absolute dream would be a Holyrood election at the same time as a Westminster election, because they would be able to ride in the coattails of the kind of big win that's coming from them down south. But if something happened that caused a vote of no confidence, I'm not sure where John Swinney gets his majority from. Well, I thought my understanding was that as long as the Greens abstain, he's got more votes than the unionist parties together. I think there's a couple of things. I would have thought I think there was a point at which it was possible for there to be an early election, and that was when Humza Yousaf resigned, and that was avoided there because the Greens backed off. For better or worse, they said, we're prepared to give the new leader a shot. I think it would be very difficult for the Greens to then harden that position unless there was a lot of pressure from somewhere, for example, their own membership. But I'm not sure that pressure is there. And I think an important consideration for all the parties is that under the Scotland Act, even if there is an early election, there still has to be an election in 2026. Yep. So you talk about the fact, maybe Labour would love there to be a concurrent Scottish Parliament and Westminster election. It might not actually, because then suddenly you are the Starmer government. You've got responsibility for everything. And for a fact that in a year and a half, you've got to go to the polls again in Scotland. And the SNP is now the opposition party, and they can say, this is what a Labour government in Holyrood and in Westminster looks like. And if you don't like it, we are the main opposition, vote for us. And I think that's tough. I think that is actually maybe a difficult place to be, especially because I just don't think that Starmer is actually going to be capable of fixing the problems in Britain.
My main thought is that if there was some kind of vote of no confidence and he went to the Greens, he would be in a very difficult position if they turned around and went, sure, we'll vote for you as long as you sack Kate Forbes. And then he's in a situation of looking really weak to his own sort of party, but the fact that, he's had to sack his deputy, or he feels he can't do that because it would make him too weak, in which case the Greens probably would vote against them. I just think there's a lot of uncertainty in that parliamentary arithmetic. And the fact that there has been these kind of digs towards the Greens, and there seems to be a narrative coming out of the SNP, or the early stages of a narrative that is, all that crazy gender stuff and all that we get caught on, that was actually the Greens. That's all the Greens' fault, and they try to detach themselves and, go in quite a horrible direction, in which case, I think the Greens would be quite happy to vote against them if it came to it.
I think that kind of happens in all coalition agreements. The smaller party always gets blamed for everything unpopular, and the larger party takes the credit for everything popular. I think anyone probably could have seen that coming, and I think the Greens...
I did make that argument at the time when I voted against it.
Yeah, and I think Greens, maybe some people had the idea that because it's not an official, formal coalition, full-fledged thing, then, that won't apply to us, and that's not how most people see it.
Yeah. How was it not a coalition? They were literally sitting around the cabinet table. Mm-hmm. They were just they just gave it another name.
Well, actually, technically, Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater were not cabinet members.
Well,
because they were junior ministers,
members of the government.
Yeah, I think they were invited to attend cabinet on certain occasions. I don't know if that was always, but they certainly weren't formal cabinet members. Which is the other thing is junior ministerial posts. I don't think most people couldn't name a junior minister. The cabinet secretaries are really the only recognisable ones. So I know that the reason they probably didn't want a cabinet post, probably because then you are bound by the kind of collective responsibility that, we see every cabinet secretary has to stand by everything. But
I don't know. I'm the opposite. I see people, and I think, they're in the cabinet, and then they announce this cabinet. I'm like, oh my God, such and such is on it. And then I remember, they've always been as a junior minister, but do all the junior ministers report to a cabinet secretary?
Yeah.
Right. So that's that makes more sense because some of a lot of the kind of titles of the junior ministers, they don't seem to match up with specific cabinet secretaries. So I don't know, confuses me.
Yeah, sometimes it is quite confusing. And also, I think, it is a very centralised thing, the Scottish government. It's not like there's different government departments with their own websites or something. It's all the Scottish government. I think they don't even refer to them as having departments. There's another word they use for it. Directories or something like that. It's a very strange thing, the way that they've structured it.
You mentioned earlier about the Minister for Independence position being abolished. I thought that Indy Daz would be a lot angrier about that, but I've not actually seen anything.
I don't know. I feel like it's just there's not actually that much discussion about independence happening right now outside of kind of certain activist circles. The SNP mainstream is talking about how do we protect the government, how do we defeat the Labour Party, how do we make sure we still win this election and that election, and even in terms of the general election that's looming, very few people are talking about it in the context of isn't this meant to be part of a plan to get independence? What is that plan? Nobody knows. So when he says it was the same plan that it was before I came in, nobody knew what that was either.
Yeah, is it still
it's still the case that a majority...
is it still the de facto referendum that they were talking about at one stage? That seems to have dropped off the radar completely.
It depends on how you even interpret the words de facto referendum, because what they're saying now, or what Swinney appeared to say recently, is that if we win a majority of seats, that is a mandate to have a referendum. And that's different from de facto referendum. A de facto referendum would be saying
51%.
The result is the referendum. Otherwise, you're not talking about de facto referendum, you're talking about de facto election. That's what it is already. It's de jure an election. So it's very unclear. And it's also a bit of a moot point because everyone kind of can accept that it's not going to be a good election result for the SNP. And there's very little that can change in the next, 6 months to stop that from being the case.
Yeah, I still think they actually might not do as terrible as the poll suggests. The fact that the Tories are going to get wiped out, the SNP will probably inherit quite a few of these seats. Which could, radically change the sort of internal politics of the SNP, because you might see a lot of more left Glasgow sort of based MPs lose their seats and be replaced by, Aberdeenshire sort of MPs, which would be another sort of negative column to look at, another thing in the negative column.
I think Labour Party will win, Scottish Labour will win more MPs than the SNP in the general election this year. I'm not going to do a Paddy Ashdown eat my hat thing on the podcast, but we can revisit it after the result and see who's right.
We'll need to come up. We'll need to bet something. I'd be willing to bet the SNP might still hang on to a majority of seats, even if it's only like 30.
I think it's something to bet on.
Well, thank
you.
By
the next episode, we'll have something.
£500. I don't know why I said that. I'm not that confident. I mean, I'm fairly confident, not £500.
No, you're bluffing, David. You just want me to accept it. I'm not doing it.
Let's move on to our next topic. Scottish Labour seem to believe they are poised to return to their position of historic electoral dominance in Scotland over the next electoral cycle. But will they be undermined by their UK counterparts more concerned with other parts of the UK? Keir Starmer welcomed the defection of hard-right Tory MP Natalie Elphicke from the Tories, while Labour Health spokesman Wes Streeton undercut Scottish Labour's attacks on the SNP's management of the NHS by insisting all roads lead back to Westminster in defence of the Welsh Labour government. So what do you think? Natalie Elphicke, what can you say about that,
It's kind of sick. More than anything, it's just, I think it signals exactly what the Starmer project's about, who he wants to try and bring into the Labour Party in terms of voters, not just in terms of MPs. He's saying, we are the party that is going to be really hard on the small boats. We are the party that is going to bring down immigration. The Tories aren't competent enough to do it. The big message from Natalie Elphicke is, well, she's the MP whose constituency includes Dover. So you couldn't find a better endorsement that Starmer's the man for stopping these boats coming to Dover. And it's just really grotesque. It's got nothing to do with the politics of solidarity. It's all about ratcheting up this racism that has pervaded British politics for forever, really, but in a very acute way over the last 20 years or so. So, yeah, I find the whole thing just really, really disgusting.
But it's the fact that people, I think there was rumblings that she was going to leave the Tories, and people thought she was going to defect to Reform, which kind of says everything about her.
Yeah.
And now she's in the Labour Party. I mean, she's so, and again, just kind of talking about, how that doesn't help Scottish Labour in terms of, Natalie Elphicke is so beyond Overton window in Scotland. The only thing that the average Scot could relate to her is how gleeful she was when England missed a penalty. The only thing is, Scottish people are motivated by rivalry. She was motivated by the fact she hates Marcus Rashford for daring to say, why don't we feed hungry children? That's the kind of thing that really gets her back up. People not want to be overly and outright cruel to children or desperate people fleeing war and famine.
And also, she's not even planning to stand in the next election, is my understanding. So she's just kind of coming over as a stunt, and then she's not going to actually be the candidate.
I never realised that. That seems even more pointless then.
It's not about we're trying to win over this constituency or something, even though that I think would be just as equally politically bankrupt. It's just a stunt. And it also means if she's standing down as an MP, I understand that gets you a better pension on the other side of it. So that'll be very good for someone who only became an MP in 2019 when she took over the seat from her criminal ex-husband.
Yeah, I mean,
the circumstances in which she became an MP in the first place are, very dodgy, and the comments that she made have been getting some scrutiny quite fairly, I think. And obviously I don't think she can be held responsible for the abhorrent things that her husband did, but she has effectively inherited a seat in Parliament. I think that speaks to the bizarre kind of way in which British politics functions. It's very incestuous and not very democratic. And of course, the Labour Party is so enmeshed in the Westminster politics, it doesn't actually want to challenge that or change it, the culture or the structure. So, of course, that's very compatible with them.
Yeah, you can't hold her responsible for her husband's actions, but she did publicly attack the women that had been victims of him. And recently she was suspended because she was trying to influence the judge that was presiding over the case. So, There is...
Oh, and she tried to meet the Justice Secretary as well, the Lord Chancellor.
Yeah.
It's just a bizarre thing.
She wrote to the judge using, like, you know, the power of her office as an MP, you know. You know, really, like, even, we don't spoke, apart from sort of immigration stance, we've not spoke much about her politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, like, she's just a horrible human being, by the looks of it, you know. But it just, that clearly doesn't matter to Keir Starmer. You know, like, things like decency go out the window, like, you know, there's no sense of decency in Starmer. I think we could have all guessed that with, like, the way, you know, he's treated a lot of his own MPs, a lot of normal Labour members that, members for decades have been hounded out because they liked around social media posts or showed some kind of solidarity to the Palestinian people. I think I've run out of words to express the absolute contempt and dislike and disgust I feel towards our next Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, the next couple of years with him as PM is just going to be hellish.
And the other thing about Scottish Labour recently, beyond the fact that I think you wanted to talk about the fact they've got all these candidates in Scotland that actually live in England. I don't know if you've got a bit prepared on that.
No, I've just, you know...
I've got the list in front of me. So
yeah.
there's 4 that were pointed out by the National. So Melanie Ward, she's the CEO of Medical Aid for Palestinians, which actually it feels unremarked upon that she wants to be a Labour candidate, which is kind of concerning about the direction that Medical Aid for Palestinians goes into, that she would be comfortable. Also
kind of shocking that doesn't disqualify her, given...
Yeah, second CEO of a charity. I mean, I assume that if she's elected, you know, I assume during the campaign period she'll recuse herself from work, and if she's elected, she'll resign. But the CEO of a charity that's kind of the main charity in Britain that supports Palestinians and has actively called as an organisation for a ceasefire, being a candidate for a party whose leader said Israel has the right to cut off water and food, things that have led to the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court trying to issue an arrest warrant for Netanyahu and his defence minister. I think that's really bad, but that apparently doesn't get talked about. It's just the fact that she lost a selection battle in the south of London, and now she's been parachuted into Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, which is a target seat of the Labour Party. I think that is ridiculous. And then you've got a councillor in Kent who's been made the candidate for Angus and Patricia Glens. Councillor in Lewisham. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Lewisham. Appointed for the candidate in Caithness, Sutherland, Easter Ross. Candidate in Orkney and Shetland, who actually does live in Edinburgh, so that's kind of in Scotland at least. But previously ran as a candidate in Wales. So they're just kind of like throwing people all over the place. So I think, you know, the criticism that they've got for that is quite right and justified. But then the other thing that I know you didn't put down is this proposal they've got that we've got to introduce mayors. We've got to have elected mayors in Scotland. There needs to be like an Aberdeen mayor. Just trying to make Scottish political life just more like English politics. You know, we've got to, when we talk about devolution, it's not about transferring power from Westminster, a really profoundly undemocratic institution, and moving it to the Scottish Parliament, which has got a really strong amount of support and it's a lot more democratic and it kind of fulfills an aspiration for national politics here. No, we've got to be talking about transferring power away from the Scottish Parliament and putting it in the hands of these kind of individual, directly elected people, these kind of mini presidents, who are going to exercise that power in their little region, their little fiefdoms. And of course, the big appeal for this, for a lot of people in the Labour Party, is like it's a new tier of, you know, for your career. You know, now used to be the case you'd be a councillor and then you'd be an MP, or maybe MSP in the middle. But now it could be like, you know, you could be a mayor before you become an MP and before you become a cabinet minister. So now you've got a new kind of system of progression. That seems to me the biggest thing that they want.
I've never really elected mayors have been a thing for quite a while now in England, and I've never really heard a proper justification as to why they're necessary or why they make anything better. In which, so it's kind of like, if you're looking to make changes to local government in Scotland, the first thing I would be screaming about is let's have actual local councils as opposed to when I live South Lanarkshire, a local council that has like 300,000 people living in it. I don't see what benefit I would get if they turned around and went, oh, but you're going to get to elect the mayor of South Lanarkshire. I'd be like, well, so what? Like, what is the benefit of that? In terms of bringing up the candidates from like South of England and things like that, I wonder what that speaks to. Does that speak to a weakness in Scottish Labour that they're not coming up with candidates or not coming up with candidates of sufficient quality? Or is that, again, and this is very likely, to do with the control freakery that we've seen within the UK Labour Party, and their need to centralise absolutely everything and the need to control everything. We've seen them directly intervene to exclude people from being MPs in local areas, and we've also seen them, place their hand-picked candidates in. So it does make me suspicious that are they parachuting these people in from England as part of a control effort and part of a centralisation effort in order to, so that the party can be controlled from Westminster, and again to kind of hamstring the Scottish Labour. Know that Anas Sarwar needs hamstrung. He seems quite happy to be kept in the pocket of his boss in Westminster.
I think it's partly that, and I think it's also partly that, they're desperate for people who actually want to be candidates, because there's not exactly a huge, even though the Labour Party's support is going up, it's not like they've got a huge body of activists and a huge body of people who are desperate to be candidates and are qualified to be candidates, especially in these parts of Scotland, like in the Highlands and the Caithness and Angus and Perthshire Glens. These are never places that have been strongholds of the Labour Party, so I think they probably can't fucking find anyone to an extent.
Next item in the agenda. Rishi Sunak has mentioned Scottish nationalists in a list of threats to the UK. The Tory Prime Minister listed Scottish nationalism alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and gender activists. It came in a section of a speech on the dangers that threaten our country at the Policy Exchange think tank in London. These remarks coincided with Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack's comments to the House of Lords Committee, where he said that he expected a unionist regime in Scotland after 2026, which would allow nuclear reactors to be built in Scotland. The Scottish Secretary went on to suggest a Grand Committee of the House of Lords should also be scrutinising Holyrude legislation. How do you feel to be an extremist, Connor?
I think it's great. I've always wanted to be an extremist.
See, I was going to say that. I think it sounds dangerous and edgy.
Yeah, making it sound cool. So, I mean, I think you have to place, so the comments that he's made, I think if you place them in the context, right now we've got a UK government that is increasingly trying to criminalise protest in England and Wales. The kind of at the forefront of that has been the climate groups over the last 5 years. So that's Extinction Rebellion and more lately Just Stop Oil. It was also for a moment, Insulate Britain. And also these Palestine solidarity groups like Palestine Action, the group that's been occupying arms factories and has taken credit for actually getting some of these shut down permanently. The UK government is being describing these as extreme protest groups, and they are trying to create a political consensus around, we have to take action, we have to smash these groups. There was a really good ruling in the High Court in London this morning that said Suella Braverman, when she implemented this really tight restriction on protests, what was allowed, she actually overstepped her boundaries. She wasn't allowed to do it. So it's been struck down. The government is going to appeal it. But actually, this is a law, a rule that when she brought it in, Keir Starmer himself, a human rights lawyer by profession, didn't oppose it because he also wants to be seen as, standing up against these climate extremists because, God, they sit in traffic, and then isn't it such a pain when you're sitting in traffic because of these extremists?
Yeah, extremists used to be people that blew things up.
Yeah.
And now it seems to be anybody the government doesn't like.
Mm-hmm. So there's Lord Walney, I think his name is. He is the UK government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. But they've put these two things together, violence and disruption, as if they're comparable. And he had a report, it's actually come out today, but there's a leaked draft that the BBC saw and reported on earlier this month that seemingly said that these extreme protest groups like Palestine Action and Extinction Rebellion should be banned, or the government should consider explicitly proscribing them in the same way that they proscribe terrorist groups. Now, the actual final version of this report that's come out today says, we need a new mechanism that's kind of similar to proscription, so we can say that these particular groups are dangerous and bad, so we're going to put restrictions on them that don't apply to other people. And that is deeply alarming, a deeply bizarre thing, that is, again, being done because they're trying to build this idea of what it means to be extreme, and they are clearly thinking strategically about, climate activism isn't going to go away. If anything, it's going to intensify because the climate crisis is going to intensify. Clearly, Palestine solidarity isn't going to go away as long as the UK continues to support Israel in committing a genocide. So I think, they realize this is a pressing threat. It's only going to get worse. And they're increasingly, even though the Scottish independence movement actually hasn't been that disruptive, because we've not been blocking roads in the streets of London, but maybe we should have been. Gregor Gall actually had a really good article in The National a week or so ago saying, look at the farmers' protests all across Europe, where farmers have gone and blocked, the entrances to national parliaments using their tractors. Maybe that's the kind of politics that we should be starting. But you already know how the government's going to respond to that, which is they're telling you, we're going to lump you in the same category as all these other groups that we're cracking down hard on. Yeah,
but I get the feeling that, if the Countryside Alliance type folk that have done rather extreme protests in the past, I didn't see them in the list of extremists,
No.
People that have broke into Parliament and through stuff, like
Fathers for Justice.
Yeah. It's again so selective and quite blatantly biased in terms of their politics, and for a government that is full of extremists, like some of the language that government ministers and the Tory government have come out with in the last few years, is the kind of thing that 20 years ago you would have been shocked to hear somebody in the street come out with, never mind somebody that holds high office. And as much as, and the more extreme they get, again with right-wingers, every accusation is a confession. When they start screaming that everybody's extremists, it's because they're extremists. Like, the fact that they're screaming, calling Palestinian solidarity protesters extremists because they don't support and don't want to support a genocide is like 1984 level, twisting of language. By any definition, this government, going back through like Brexit and things like that, is extremists. And the fact that they're projecting that on the rest of us is, quite revealing.
And also, while we're talking about disturbing language, I want to issue a correction. I said Lord Walney wrote this report. Apparently that's what John Woodcock now goes by. I had no idea that was him. Remember, he was a Labour MP. He was really against Corbyn, and then he became, was he not the one that they called the anti-Semitism Tsar, even though that was obviously a deeply inappropriate title to give to someone. Maybe it wasn't him, but nonetheless, he was like a big anti-Corbyn, Labour MP, and he's now in the House of Lords, doing reports for the Tory party on extreme protest groups, and now we need to deal with them.
It's amazing how people that do the bidding of the establishment seem to wind up in the House of Lords. I'm noticing that there's a bit of correlation there. What about, look forward to getting nuclear reactors opened up? The language again, it used a unionist regime, seemed very sinister.
That's actually the biggest thing I was going to say. The language he used to talk about a unionist regime will come in 2026. It's not exactly selling it. No. Also that is clearly looking forward to what I was saying, which is that if the Labour Party come out on top, informally they will be working with the Tory party, because I think actually the Labour Party often is desperate to be seen as even more unionist than the Tories. So I think if Sarwar becomes leader of the biggest party, a unionist regime indeed is what we'll have. But yeah, I think it's regardless of how you feel about nuclear power, because I know that the people have really strongly held views on both sides, and I haven't maybe explored either of those sides to the extent that I want. I think it's a democratic outrage for that to be imposed on Scotland when we have an elected government that has a long-standing position on this that clearly hasn't been met with big opposition in Scotland. I think it's been accepted that that's the case, especially because we don't actually need nuclear power in Scotland because we've got such a wealth of renewable energy sources that we're actually able to regularly produce more than 100% of our energy needs from renewables. So if they need to be built anywhere, they don't need to be built here. And then also, people say, well, there's no argument against nuclear power, etc. But, you do need uranium or some other kind of fissionable material. It has to come from somewhere. Unless you want to open mines in Scotland, which I don't think anyone actually wants to see, we'll have to import it. Where do we import it from? What are the conditions there? I don't see why that is better than, trying to build up our renewable energy capacity. So, yeah, I think he can stick his reactor where the sun don't shine.
Yeah, I mean, they love nuclear power because they can make money out of it. They can't commoditize, the sunshine the same sort of way as you can with, uranium or whatever other material they'll be using. They say that it's like, a lot of people that are in favour will say that the danger of nuclear power is overstated. And I'm sure compared to 30, 40 years ago, it's safer than it was. And it was probably statistically pretty safe there. The trouble is, if it does go wrong, the consequences are so extreme and so dire that I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with any percentage at all. Even if they say, look, they're 99.9% safe, but when the potential result, if there is some kind of meltdown, is at least the whole country, in the worst scenario, the whole continent becomes completely uninhabitable. Let's just stick with the windmills. It's just not worth it.
Yeah. I've seen Godzilla,
Exactly. At least something good comes out of nuclear. Giant lizards that'll protect us.
I've been actually on a really big Godzilla kick recently, and it is, there's a 2016 Japanese one called Shin Godzilla, and I really like it because the 1950s one, it's Godzilla as this is what dropping the bomb on Japan by America did, and how it's kind of affected our psyche. And then 2016 Japanese Shin Godzilla is actually more thinking about the Fukushima accident, what happened with the tsunami, and the fact that the government was just so incompetent. So you've got this great thing of like, it's a Godzilla movie, but most of the movie is government officials in suits running around arguing on the phone over who's responsible for this and whose permission do I need, whose approval do I need on this thing that we're going to do about Godzilla, who's right there. And that's the thing, like that's not what you want.
Also, I mean, it's a good point as well. Like the level of competence in government, I don't know, maybe governments were always this incompetent, but in the age of social media, they're just exposed more. But my God, the absolute idiots that are in that Downing Street cabinet, can you imagine them trying to deal with a nuclear catastrophe? Like I watched, I finally got around to watching Chernobyl a few months ago. And could you imagine Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, for God's sake, sitting around a table trying to deal with and trying to understand, we're going to use boron, this is melting into we need to do this, we need these materials. It just would be screwed completely.
Well, we saw that. Boris Johnson presided over the pandemic. We saw how catastrophic, but let the bodies pile high, let the radiation drown us. That would be kind of the attitude that he would take. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just, to me, there's a cost benefit judgment that you can make about nuclear power. And we're in a remarkably privileged position where we actually don't have to make that decision. Maybe in places that don't have as much access to renewable energy sources, I'll say make the decision that you think is right, whatever, but we're in this position where we don't have to.
And the fact that they are sort of not quite carbon neutral, but certainly compared to like coal or oil power stations, we're seeing like nuclear was kind of gone. Like pro-nuclear people had kind of lost the argument, but we're seeing them coming back wrapped up in these green arguments now, and they're making a kind of push. But hopefully we don't see a unionist regime and that puts pay to any nuclear reactors up here, but we'll see. The whole thing about House of Lords Committee scrutinising Holyrood legislation, that feels like a wee kind of another step, like, using the section 35, was it?
Yeah.
Using the section 35s that I've worked now because the Swinney government's not going to do anything that could be subject to that, I don't think. I think they've been effectively cowed into, I was going to say not doing anything too radical, but a bloody deposit return scheme is not exactly Che Guevara territory.
And even that didn't go to the courts. I think, you can let me know if I'm wrong, but I think that question of the Internal Market Act, the government didn't want to fight it. And I think there's a reason that the government wants to avoid being drawn into these legal battles, because they think, the public doesn't really like to see us losing money. The public's got an aversion to seeing spent so many hundreds of thousands of pounds on lawyers because, that's money going in the pockets of wealthy people. But there is actually a point there that you can't have devolution just run ramshackle over and just not do anything about it. I think it's completely, as people said at the time of the Section 35 and the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, that has proven to be true, that you're blowing open the doors and they will do this for everything. And they have, and that's it. The Lord's suggestion is ridiculous, but obviously the spirit of that is, you guys can't be trusted. You need some of the big boys, the old decrepit, unelected, rich people in London to come in and make sure that you're doing it right.
I think it's quite reminiscent of the sort of strategy that is often used to privatise industries, where they sort of undermine things, make sure it doesn't work properly, erode public confidence in it. And I feel that's exactly what they're trying to do to the Scottish Parliament. You see people online where, like, people that are kind of casually aware of politics, not really involved, but, keep a bit up to date. And their interpretation is that Scotland messed up and couldn't organise a deposit return scheme. We couldn't organise, we were too incompetent to organise a recycling scheme. It's not the reality. The reality is, it was just torpedoed by the UK government. So this idea that that the Scottish Parliament's incompetent, or the Scottish government's incompetent, is creeping into the public psyche, and that'll be used to get to a point where they feel comfortable basically announcing that they're going to abolish the Scottish Parliament, maybe in conjunction with elected mayors, to see like, this way doesn't work. We're going to devolve power and try to make it seem like a positive step and a progressive thing. But it's just so concerning.
Yeah, and there's also, it's not just Scotland, it's also in Wales. There's a battle going on about the deposit return scheme there, because again, the Welsh government wanted to include glass, which is something also a Tory MSP said should happen in Scotland. So it wasn't even necessarily along party political lines. It's just that we've got a UK government that is doing a really good job of finding wedges to exploit. And actually, I think, the Scottish media has got a lot of responsibility to bear in terms of how little they've exposed that dynamic. So, for example, the reporting on the collapse of Circularity Scotland, the fact it went into administration, these jobs were lost, and, there was an investment by the Scottish National Investment Bank that obviously, went tits up. I don't think that was contextualised properly in the sense of the Scottish government wanted to do a certain thing, the UK government prevented it from happening, and the legislation it used, it wasn't to do with the Scotland Act, it was specifically to do with the post-Brexit Internal Market Act. So at the time, in the post-Brexit period where the SNP was saying this is going to lead to an assault on devolution, a rolling back of devolution, they were completely right and they were vindicated. And that is kind of absent from the political discussion that was the case. And I say that as someone, I don't even think I was that convinced at the time that there was going to be this full frontal assault on devolution, but clearly it's panned out that has actually happened. And a lot of people don't want to admit it.
Yeah, and I wonder how that will change with a Labour government if they're quite as hell-bent and, because the Tories never wanted the Scottish Parliament. They, opposed the referendum to create it. Labour like to sort of paint themselves as the party of devolution and try to take this middle ground between, being London-centric and being pro-independence. But I'm not convinced that if the SNP rallied and won another term in 2026, London Labour's attitude would just be, well, if we can't run it, then nobody will run it. I think they'll tolerate it if they can control it enough. But if they find that the SNP are going to be in charge in perpetuity, which seems ridiculous, but 20 years is a long time and they've been in charge for nearly that long. I don't see Labour really being any kind of safeguard in protecting the Scottish Parliament. Move on to our final topic. Even though Deborah was the one that wanted this in. Residents in parts of Devon were told to boil their drinking water after South West Water found 46 confirmed cases of people being infected by the parasite Cryptosporidium. Other reported cases of diarrhoea and vomiting in residents and visitors are also under investigation, and hundreds of locals have reported feeling unwell over the last 2 weeks on social media. MPs and South West Water officials have confirmed the parasite most likely entered water supplies through animal faeces, but an investigation is still ongoing. I mean, infrastructure's crumbling, corruption and hatred seem rampant in the UK. It's like, the UK doesn't even feel like a proper developed country anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly say, everyone always boasts about Scottish tap water being better than English tap water. I think you could now prove that because ours doesn't have parasites in it.
Yeah, we used to make that claim based on taste, not it won't give you extreme diarrhea,
Yeah, well, soon they'll be saying, the parasites actually taste really nice. Yeah, it's really appalling. And it's a story about the impact of privatisation. It's a story about what happens when you say profit should be the main motive in supplying essential things. Think about, plumbing is a marvel when you think about it. The fact that we've got all access to clean, fresh drinking water in all of our homes. There was a time when that wasn't the case, and that was a pipe dream, literally, no pun intended. And that's an accomplishment that now seems like we probably couldn't do that today. We can barely keep the infrastructure going that we have. And yeah, I mean, that's where the whole UK is tending towards. Everything is collapsing. We're an international joke.
I mean, I can't remember if I said it in the pod, but I remember saying before that, can you imagine if we didn't have indoor plumbing?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody suggested it. There is no chance in hell the current not just the current government, the whole current political setup would be like, that is ludicrous. That is completely unworkable. What, you're going to get pipes from the water source to every single house. Every house in the country, you're going to bring pipes into more than one room. It reminded me of when they thought Corbyn was communist for wanting to have public broadband. It's like
broadband communism. What you want? Water communism.
So can you imagine if the first guy that suggested plumbing water into everybody's house? It's the exact same thing. There's so many things where once it happens, we're taken for granted, but the week before it happened, people were ridiculed for it. Often think like free public transport's another one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like it's often ridiculed and seen as like this, you know, fantasy. But I think 10 years after it came in, it would seem like the most normal thing in the world, and nobody would question it.
Mm-hmm.
You're right as well about the fact that, you know, it is completely, you know, privatisation is at the root of the issues that England are having with our water. And it's quite shocking that there's no appetite at the top of politics to do anything about it. You know, like, I didn't see any quotes from, like, you know, the Prime Minister or Keir Starmer, you know, taking a position on this, or, you know, the fact that, you know, an area of the UK now didn't have, like, something as basic as running water.
When we all saw in the news the thing in Flint, Michigan, where their drinking water was undrinkable, and I think they're actually still having problems there. Everyone saw that as evidence of the US being this kind of failed state. And now it's the same thing in England, and we're meant to believe it's just how it is. And, you know, you talk about the politicians and the fact that there's a kind of a culture of acceptance of that. I mean, look at just today, the report that's come out from the Infected Blood Inquiry. That is a huge scandal. That's 30,000 people between the 1970s to the 1990s who were infected either with hepatitis or HIV because they got blood products or transfusions from contaminated blood. And that's, you know, there's a degree to which that was unavoidable because they didn't have there was not as much technology to kind of look at these samples of blood. There wasn't as much knowledge about the transmission of things like HIV at the time that the AIDS crisis was beginning. But what there was as soon as it became clear, instead of responding to that and dealing with it, there was a culture of secrecy. There was a cover-up. They literally were destroying documents in Whitehall to prevent anyone finding out about how badly they had messed up. And they dragged out for decades the question of accountability and compensation, even just like being honest with people about what had happened. And 3,000, like, of those 30,000 people, 3,000 died, and apparently more are expected to die as a result of things that are linked to this. And those people had families. And that was successive governments. That wasn't just one government. And I think it speaks to a whole culture, a Westminster culture, a Whitehall culture. We don't like to admit problems. And the British political culture is completely built around deny, defer. You know, maybe in 20 to 30 years' time, there'll be an inquiry that says, all right, okay, well, we can move past this now because we've put it on paper. Yeah, I was bad, but those people aren't around anymore. So that's it. That's just it in a nutshell.
Yeah, we've seen a more recent example of that with the whole Postmaster stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I think this also kind of shows us how much we need to protect Scottish water, as in like as a public resource. I mean, we're talking about the kind of way the UK is declining. Its economy is kind of descending into a kind of plunder economy, and when it gets to that, they'll look for more things that they can exploit for short-term economic gain. And I'm sure it's been talked about that despite the kind of huge examples down south of, you know, how disaster it is to privatise water, there will be people in government in Westminster looking at Scottish water as a public utility, and they want to do the same thing despite this overwhelming evidence it would be a bad idea, because they're not motivated by providing a public service or providing people. They're motivated by the fact they can privatise it and they can make money out of it in the short term. And that's what it's about, and that's why it could still happen. Because as long as there's people there that can benefit financially, they will push it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't be complacent about it. And actually, I think the trade unions at Scottish Water have actually been sounding the alarm for a wee while that the management of Scottish Water, I think there actually is a crossover with people who have been bosses at English water companies. And there has been some use of private operators for certain things. And so they're saying be vigilant and try and fight back against this, because there is always a threat of privatisation by the back door if there's not an overt one. And yeah, we can see exactly what the risk is. So yeah, strongly encourage people that if you value having Scottish Water be what it is, then you've got to be prepared to fight for it.
And on that note, we will end tonight's podcast. You can find all our podcasts at leftungagged.org, as well as written articles, and you can sign up for a free newsletter. If you get anything you'd like us to talk about in Holyrude Ungagged, you can tweet us at _ungagged, #Holyrude Ungagged, or drop us an email, ungaggedleft@gmail.com, putting Holyrude Ungagged in the subject line. If you're also interested, you can join our Signal group. We've got a thriving community there. You can chat to all of us and get involved with the organisation. And if you'd enjoyed this podcast, please give us 5 stars on whatever podcast platform you use. Connor, thanks for joining us. I've enjoyed our conversation. And until then, until next time, have fun, be good.